June 1941. Eastern Europe. Germany drives into the Soviet Union, and the fighting on the Eastern Front quickly descends into a war of starvation, executions, and relentless brutality. The men of the 1st Mountain Division, who served there, grow hardened and indifferent to suffering, shaped both by the violence they witness and the violence they are ordered to inflict. When these troops are later sent into the Balkans, they carry this brutality with them. Villages burn, civilians are shot, and terror becomes routine. But the crimes of these men will not remain unpunished, and by the end of the Second World War, thousands of them will pay for what they had done with their own lives. At the outbreak of the Second World War on September 1st, 1939, the 1st Mountain Division, an elite unit of the German army, the Wehrmacht, participated in the invasion of Poland with a strength of nearly 25,000 men. The unit, which was created in April 1938 and used the Edelweiss flower as its identification symbol, had distinguished itself during fighting in the Carpathian Mountains. Already during this first phase of the Second World War, members of the division committed their first war crimes when they killed 6 civilians and 3 prisoners of war on the 8th of September 1939 in the Polish village of Rozdziel. These acts were part of German policy against civilian population of Poland, during which the German soldiers were trained to see civilians not as people, but as potential enemies. In the spring of 1940, the division joined the attack against Western Europe, and soon they were fighting in the forests around the rivers Meuse and the Aisne. It gained a reputation for moving quickly and efficiently, and when France surrendered after 6 weeks, parts of the division were held in reserve for possible operations against the United Kingdom. They were formed into a combat group, which was tasked with capturing the heavily fortified and modern armed British fortress of Gibraltar with its strategically important naval base. This proposed campaign, codenamed Operation Felix, could have decisively weakened Britain's naval supremacy in the Mediterranean if ever took place. However, even during the covert reconnaissance, Francisco Franco, the Spanish dictator, refused to cooperate because Adolf Hitler was unable to make any concrete promises regarding his desired territorial plans in the Pyrenees and the expansion of the Spanish colonial empire, which would be built from French colonies. As a result, Operation Felix was never carried out. Soon the division was transferred and used in an attack against Yugoslavia in April 1941. Here the division received another quick victory when the country fell in just a few days. But the time of German quick victories was coming to an end, and the war that was coming would last much longer and turn far more savage. In June 1941, the 1st Mountain Division joined the invasion of the Soviet Union as part of Army Group South. Its soldiers fought in the forests and fields of Ukraine, capturing towns such as Vinnytsia and Uman. There, under the command of General Major Hubert Lanz, they took part in the destruction of the encircled Soviet armies, taking tens of thousands of prisoners. While some of those prisoners were handed over to the SS and shot, others were left to die of hunger and cold in the camps established for captured Soviet soldiers. In the city of Lviv, in today's Ukraine, which fell early in the German campaign against the Soviet Union, members of the division and local Ukrainian militia joined in the pogroms that killed thousands of Jews in the streets. The division's command played a part in the violence by fueling hatred and by turning away as atrocities against civilian population took place. In 1942, the division took part in Hitler's Great Southern Offensive. Advancing into the Caucasus toward the Black Sea, the mountain troops fought there, way through passes over 3,000 meters high. In August 1942, they climbed Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in Russia and Europe, and raised the Nazi flag on the summit, a symbolic victory, celebrated in German newsreels across Europe. But the campaign itself ended in failure, and the Soviet counteroffensive forced them to retreat through the same mountains they had conquered, leaving behind hundreds of dead and frostbitten men. By the spring of 1943, the division was a shadow of what it had been. More than 19,000 men had been killed. The remnants who staggered back from the Eastern Front were veterans shaped by extreme cold, hunger, and violence. In 1943, the division was withdrawn from the Eastern Front and sent to the Balkans, where a new kind of war awaited them. Instead of fighting regular armies, the Edelweiss soldiers were ordered to crush partisan movements in Yugoslavia, Albania, and Greece. Under the General Major Walter Stettner Ritter von Grabenhofen, they received direct instructions from the German High Command to use extreme measures. In this territory, villages suspected of helping partisans were to be destroyed, their livestock seized, and their inhabitants executed. This was no longer war in the traditional sense, but organized terror against the civilian population. The division's reputation for brutality grew rapidly as they fought against partisans in Montenegro, where they shot prisoners without trial. Members of the unit were killing also in Albania, where they committed Borovë massacre, which took place on July 6, 1943, and is considered the worst Wehrmacht crime in Albania, where the members of the 98th Regiment of the 1st Mountain Division, armed with flamethrowers, set every house in the village on fire, and while some of the victims were shot and killed, many were grouped inside the village church and burned alive. After this massacre, in the summer of 1943, the unit was transferred to Epirus in northwestern Greece. This region, with its steep mountains and isolated villages, was suspected of harboring resistance fighters of the Edes movement, a Greek nationalist organization under Napoleon Zervas that fought both the Germans and, at times, the communist ELAS partisans. The German command decided to destroy any village connected with them. On July 25, 1943, soldiers from the 98th Regiment of the 1st Mountain Division surrounded the village of Mousiotitsa, home to shepherds and farmers who lived off the land. The troops divided into 4 groups and attacked from all sides. They looted homes, set fire to buildings, and rounded up the villagers on a plateau above the town. In the late afternoon, the captives were lined up and shot with machine guns. 136 people were killed that day, elderly, women, and children. The bodies were thrown into a dry well because there were too few survivors left to dig graves. A month later, on August 27, 1943, the same unit returned and murdered 17 more people, including entire families. The German report later claimed they had killed 100 bandits, a lie repeated to justify the killings. The Mousiotitsa massacre was only the beginning of the terror in Epirus. In the following weeks, the 1st Mountain Division destroyed village after village. In the village of Kommeno, on August 16, 1943, 317 civilians were murdered, among them pregnant women, elderly and small children. Germans murdered in this attack 94 kids under the age of 15. Members of the 1st Mountain Division continued their bloody work in Greece also during the autumn of 1943. In the village of Lingiades on October 3, 1943, after partisans had killed a German officer, the division took revenge by executing 92 civilians, most of them women and children, and burning the entire village. Only 5 people survived the massacre as they feigned death among the corpses and then escaped from the burning buildings by ascending via the fireplace chimney. The division's greatest crime came after Italy's capitulation in September 1943. The Italian troops stationed on the Ionian Islands refused to surrender to the Germans. The Edelweiss Division was ordered to disarm them. On Kefalonia, between the 21st and the 24th of September 1943, the division massacred around 5,200 Italian soldiers of the 33rd Acqui Division who were previously their allies in the conquest of the Balkan territory during the war. A few weeks later, in Sarandë, a city in Albania, the members of the division executed the officers of the Italian 151st Perugia Division after they had surrendered. In total, during the summer and autumn of 1943, The 1st Mountain Division destroyed more than 200 villages in western Greece and Albania, burned over 4,500 houses, and killed at least 2,000 civilians. Only 23 German soldiers died in combat during the same period, showing that these were not battles but massacres. Women, children, and the elderly were often killed first, and entire communities were left in ruins. The division's soldiers called these operations Bandenbekämpfung, anti-bandit warfare, but they were in fact acts of extermination. By late 1944, the war was turning against Germany. The division, still fighting in Yugoslavia and later in Hungary, faced heavy losses. And on March 12, 1945, the division was renamed the 1st Volksgebirgs Division and fought its last battles on the Austrian territory. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the remaining soldiers surrendered to the Americans. The story of the 1st Mountain Division is the story of how a proud elite formation, born in the snowy Alps, was transformed into an instrument of massacre. Trained for climbing peaks, its soldiers ended up burning homes and shooting villagers. They brought with them the habits of the Eastern Front: obedience, hardness, and the belief that any act could be justified as part of the struggle against the so-called bandits. By the end of the war, the Edelweiss they wore was no longer a symbol of purity, but of guilt and murder. The crimes they committed in Poland, the Soviet Union, Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia stand as a dark chapter in the history of the German army. But those who murdered innocent civilians faced justice. Thousands were killed already during the war, such as General Lieutenant Walter Stettner Ritter von Grabenhofen, who went missing and was probably killed during the fighting near Belgrade in September 1944. Willibald Roser, the officer responsible for the killings in Mousiotitsa and known among his comrades as the Nero of December 98, was killed during an Allied air raid on the German city of Freiburg in November 1944. Others were executed by Allies after the war, like former commander of the division, General of Mountain Troops Joseph Kubler, who was hanged in Ljubljana on February 26, 1947. In the Balkans, the crimes of the Edelweiss Division are still remembered. Mousiotitsa, Kommeno, Lingiades, and Borovë rose again from the ashes, and their inhabitants gather every year to honor the victims. Monuments mark the execution sites, and their inhabitants gather every year to honor the victims. Monuments mark the execution sites, and the scars of these atrocities endure in graves and ruins that remain to this day.